At 2:15 a.m. on a fog-drenched back road in Maryland, veteran trucker James Reeves saw a towering shape in his headlights, hooves on asphalt, horns catching the glare, and eyes burning yellow. The Goatman wasn't a story, it was right there. Before we dive into tonight's true highway terror, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us where you're watching from. Truck stop, diner, or home. Night drivers, this one's for you. James Reeves had been driving commercial trucks for 17 years without ever believing in monsters. He had heard all the legends that circulated through truck stops and over CB radio channels. Stories about Bigfoot crossing highways in the Pacific Northwest, tales of Chupacabra in the Southwest, and countless accounts of the Goatman, the infamous half-human, half-goat creature that supposedly haunted back roads in Maryland and Texas. James dismissed them all as campfire stories, urban legends invented by bored drivers with overactive imaginations. On October 28, 2023, at exactly 2:15 in the morning on Fletchertown Road in Prince George's County, Maryland, James Reeves learned that some legends are based on truth. His truck's headlights illuminated something standing in the middle of the road that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A creature approximately 7 feet tall, with a powerfully muscled human torso covered in dark brown fur, arms that were too long and ended in hands with fingers that looked almost human but not quite, legs that bent backward like a goat's and terminated in black cloven hooves, and rising above those impossible shoulders, the head of a massive goat with curved horns, a long face with a protruding snout, and eyes that glowed brilliant yellow in the truck's headlight beams. For 3 seconds that felt like eternity, the creature stood motionless in the center of Fletchertown Road, staring directly at James through his windshield. Then it opened its mouth, revealing rows of teeth that no herbivore should possess, and released a sound that James would describe in later interviews as the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. Part goat bleat, part human scream, part something else entirely. A sound of pure rage and hunger. Before James could react, the creature dropped to all fours and bounded off the road with impossible speed, its hooves making staccato clicks on the pavement before it disappeared into the dense Maryland forest that lined both sides of Fletchertown Road. James sat frozen in his truck, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, staring at the empty road where the impossible creature had stood moments before. James's mind raced through possible explanations. A person in a costume, but no costume could recreate the fluid, animalistic movement he had just witnessed, a hallucination brought on by fatigue. But James had gotten a full 8 hours of sleep before starting his run and felt completely alert. An optical illusion caused by shadows and headlight beams. But the creature had been too detailed, too solid, too undeniably present to be a trick of light. James forced himself to breathe slowly and assess his situation. He was alone on a dark, isolated forest road at 2:15 in the morning. His cargo of automotive parts needed to reach a warehouse in Baltimore by 7 a.m. And somewhere in the forest, less than 50 yards away, something that shouldn't exist was watching him. James grabbed his cell phone and saw he had no signal. He tried his CB radio and found only static. He was completely cut off from communication with the outside world. James made a decision. He would continue driving, get off Fletchertown Road as quickly as possible, and report what he had seen when he reached civilization. He pressed down on his accelerator, and his Kenworth moved forward, passing the spot where the creature had stood. As James's headlights swept the tree line on the right side of the road, he caught a glimpse of something moving through the forest, parallel to his truck. Something large and fast, keeping pace with his vehicle despite the trees and undergrowth. The Goatman was following him. James Reeves was 42 years old and had spent nearly half his life behind the wheel of commercial trucks. He had started driving at age 25 after serving 4 years in the United States Army, and trucking had become more than just his profession, it had become his identity. James took pride in his perfect safety record, his reputation for on-time deliveries, and his extensive knowledge of routes throughout the eastern United States. His current run was one he had made dozens of times, picking up automotive parts from a manufacturing facility in Altoona, Pennsylvania, and delivering them to an auto parts distributor in Baltimore, Maryland. The most direct route was via Interstate 70 and Interstate 70, a straightforward drive of approximately 200 miles that took roughly 4 hours. But on this particular night, James had encountered road construction that had closed 2 lanes of Interstate 70 just west of Frederick, Maryland, creating a massive traffic backup. Rather than sit in stop traffic for what could be hours, James had made the decision to exit the interstate and take back roads through Prince George's County to reach his destination. This decision would prove to be one he would regret for the rest of his life. James's GPS had guided him onto Maryland Route 4, then onto a series of increasingly smaller and more isolated roads as he navigated around the construction zone. By 2 in the morning, James found himself on Fletchertown Road, a narrow 2-lane road that cut through dense forest in one of the more remote sections of Prince George's County. The road was in poor condition, with cracks in the pavement and no shoulder on either side, just forest pressing close to the edge of the asphalt. James had been driving along Fletchertown Road for approximately 15 minutes when he noticed something unsettling. His truck's headlights, which should have illuminated the road ahead for several hundred feet, seemed to be penetrating the darkness only about 100 feet. It was as if the air itself had become thicker, absorbing light rather than allowing it to pass through. James also noticed the forest on both sides of the road seemed unusually quiet. No sounds of insects, no rustling of leaves, no distant calls of night birds. Just absolute oppressive silence, broken only by the rumble of his truck's engine. At 2:14 in the morning, James passed a small wooden sign on the right side of the road that read, Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, 3 miles. James vaguely remembered hearing something about this facility, a government research station that conducted agricultural experiments. But he had no time to dwell on it, because 1 minute later, his headlights illuminated the creature. As James drove past the spot where the Goatman had disappeared into the forest, he kept his eyes locked on the tree line to his right, where he had seen movement. For perhaps 30 seconds, he saw nothing. Then the creature burst from the forest and onto the road behind James's trailer, running on all 4s at incredible speed. James watched in his driver's side mirror as the Goatman chased his truck, its hooves striking the pavement in a rapid rhythm, its muscular body moving with a fluid grace that was simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. The creature was fast, frighteningly fast. It was gaining on James's trailer despite his truck traveling at 45 miles per hour. James pressed his accelerator harder, bringing his speed up to 50, then 55. The Goatman matched his acceleration, staying approximately 50 yards behind the trailer. James's mind was in overdrive. What did this thing want? Why was it chasing him? And most importantly, what would happen if it caught up to his truck? James had no weapons in his cab. He had never felt the need for firearms during his years of trucking. Now he wished desperately that he had at least a baseball bat or a tire iron within reach. As James watched his mirrors, the Goatman suddenly veered to the left, leaving the road and disappearing back into the forest. James felt a moment of relief, thinking the creature had given up the chase. But that relief evaporated seconds later when the Goatman burst from the forest on the left side of the road, having cut through the woods to get ahead of James's truck. The creature was now in the middle of the road, approximately 200 feet ahead, facing James's approaching vehicle. And this time, it wasn't running. It was standing upright on its hind legs, all 7 feet of its impossible height blocking the narrow road. James had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision. Brake and risk stopping near the creature, swerve and risk rolling his truck on the poor road surface, or maintain speed and hope the creature would move out of the way. James chose option 3. He kept his foot steady on the accelerator and aimed his truck straight at the Goatman. At the last possible second, when James was certain a collision was inevitable, the creature dropped to all 4s and leaped to the right side of the road with such incredible agility that it seemed to defy physics. James's truck passed through the space where the Goatman had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. In his side mirror, James saw the creature land on the shoulder of the road, then immediately leap back into pursuit, running behind the truck once again. This pattern continued for the next 10 minutes. The Goatman would disappear into the forest, then reappear either behind or ahead of James's truck, sometimes running in pursuit, sometimes attempting to block the road. Each time, James would either accelerate past or maintain speed, refusing to slow down or stop. As James drove through that nightmare on Fletchertown Road, fragments of stories he had heard over the years began surfacing in his memory. Tales told late at night in truck stops by older drivers who claimed to have seen the Goatman themselves. James had always dismissed these stories, but now they took on terrifying new significance. The Goatman legend, James remembered, had been around since at least the 1950s, with the most famous accounts coming from Prince George's County, Maryland, exactly where James was now driving. The creature was said to inhabit the forests around the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, a government facility that conducted agricultural experiments. According to the most popular version of the legend, the Goatman had been created by a scientific experiment gone wrong. A researcher at the Beltsville facility, either named William Lotsford or Stephen Fletcher, depending on which version you heard, had been conducting experiments attempting to merge human and goat DNA. The experiment had backfired catastrophically, transforming the scientist himself into a monstrous hybrid creature that escaped into the surrounding forests. Another version of the legend claimed the Goatman was simply a hermit who lived in the woods and had been given the nickname because of his goat-like appearance and behavior. But James knew from personal experience that what was chasing him was no hermit. This was something fundamentally wrong, something that violated the natural order of reality. The most famous Goatman incident had occurred in November of 1971, when a family's dog had been found decapitated on Fletchertown Road. Dozens of local residents had reported seeing a creature that looked like an animal walking on its hind legs in the days surrounding the incident. The story had gained national attention when the Washington Post published an article about the small Maryland community being terrorized by a monster. James also remembered hearing about the Texas Goatman, a separate legend centered around Old Alton Bridge in Denton, Texas. That version of the story involved a successful African-American goat farmer named Oscar Washburn, who had been lynched by the Ku Klux Klan in the 1930s. According to legend, Washburn's spirit had returned as a vengeful creature that haunted the bridge where he had died. James didn't know if the Maryland and Texas Goatmen were related, or if they were separate phenomena, or if one was real and the other pure fiction. All James knew with certainty was that something was chasing him through the Maryland night, and that something matched the descriptions he had heard in those truck stop stories. At 2:25 in the morning, after 11 minutes of being pursued by the creature, James finally saw signs of civilization ahead. The forest began to thin, and through the trees, James could see the glow of streetlights. Fletchertown Road was approaching its intersection with a larger highway. The Goatman seemed to sense that its hunting ground was ending. The creature made one final attempt to stop James, bursting from the forest and landing on the hood of James's truck with such force that the entire vehicle shuddered. James found himself staring through his windshield at the Goatman from a distance of less than 3 feet. The creature's face filled his field of vision. Yellow eyes with horizontal pupils like a goat's, but with an intelligence and malevolence that no animal should possess, stared directly into James's eyes. The creature's snout wrinkled, revealing those impossible carnivore teeth, and James could smell it now, a nauseating mixture of wet fur, decay, and something else he couldn't identify, something wrong and unnatural. The Goatman raised one of its hands and placed it against the windshield. James could see the palm was leathery and black, and the fingers, while roughly human in proportion, ended in thick, curved nails that looked capable of tearing through flesh with ease. The creature pressed against the glass, and James heard a cracking sound. The windshield was beginning to fracture under the pressure. James made a desperate decision. He slammed on his brakes. The sudden deceleration threw the Goatman forward off the hood of the truck. The creature tumbled across the pavement ahead of James's vehicle, rolled, and came up in a crouch. For a moment, James and the Goatman stared at each other through the cracked windshield. Then James shifted gears and accelerated hard, aiming his truck directly at the creature. The Goatman had two choices: move or be run over. It chose to move, leaping to the side with that same impossible agility. James's truck roared past the creature and continued toward the intersection with the larger highway. In his mirrors, James saw the Goatman standing in the middle of Fletchertown Road, watching him depart. Even from a distance of several hundred yards, James could see those yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Then the creature turned and loped back into the forest, disappearing as mysteriously as it had first appeared. James reached the intersection and turned onto Maryland Route 197, a well-lit four-lane highway with regular traffic. He was back in civilization, back in safety, or so he hoped. James pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour gas station and shut off his engine. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate his phone. But he had to document this. He had to tell someone what had happened. James spent the next 30 minutes typing out a detailed account of his encounter on his phone's notes app, recording every detail he could remember while they were still fresh in his mind. At 7 in the morning, after completing his delivery in Baltimore and parking his truck at a rest area, James sat in a diner with a cup of coffee he couldn't drink and a breakfast he couldn't eat, staring at his cracked windshield through the window. The fracture pattern was unmistakable, radiating from a central point where something heavy had pressed against the glass from outside. James had told the warehouse manager that a rock had hit his windshield during the night drive. The manager had accepted this explanation without question, but James knew the truth. That crack had been caused by the hand of something that shouldn't exist pushing against the glass hard enough to nearly shatter it. James opened his laptop and began researching the Goatman legend in earnest. What he found over the next several hours was both fascinating and terrifying. The Goatman sightings in Maryland went back much further than James had realized. While the legend had exploded into public consciousness in 1971, there were documented reports going back to 1957 when residents of Forestville and Upper Marlboro, both communities in Prince George's County, had reported seeing a hairy bipedal creature in the woods. The 1971 incident that had made the legend famous involved more than just the decapitated dog. According to contemporary newspaper accounts, dozens of Prince George's County residents had reported encounters with the creature in October and November of that year. The reports were remarkably consistent. A creature approximately 6 to 7 feet tall, with a human-like upper body, covered in dark fur, goat-like legs and hooves, and a goat's head with horns. Many witnesses reported that the creature carried an axe, though James hadn't seen any weapon during his own encounter. The origin story about the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center experiments had been popular since the beginning. In 1971, the Washington Post had reported that locals believed the Goatman was a mad scientist from Beltsville who had created a murderous axe-wielding monstrosity through his experiments. James found a spokesperson for the Agricultural Research Center had responded to the legend in 2013, dismissing it as stupid and silly, and joking about whether the Goatman should be collecting Social Security by now. But James also found darker theories. Some researchers believed the Goatman wasn't a physical creature at all, but rather a tulpa, a thought form created by the collective belief and fear of the community. According to this theory, decades of people believing in and fearing the Goatman had somehow given the legend a form of reality, manifesting it as an actual physical entity that could be seen and even interact with the physical world. James didn't know what to make of this theory. It seemed too fantastic, too much like something from a fantasy novel, But then again, so did a 7-foot-tall Goatman running through the Maryland forests. James also discovered the legend had spread far beyond Maryland. The Texas Goatman at Old Alton Bridge in Denton was just as famous, though the origin story was completely different. That creature was said to be the vengeful spirit of Oscar Washburn, a successful goat farmer who had been lynched in the 1930s by Klansmen angered by a black man's economic success. According to the legend, Washburn's body had been thrown over Old Alton Bridge, and his spirit now haunted the structure, appearing to those who crossed the bridge at night with their headlights turned off. James found accounts of Goatman sightings from multiple other states as well. Kentucky, Wisconsin, Texas, and California all had their own Goatman legends, with varying origin stories but similar descriptions of the creature. This raised an interesting question. Were all these sightings of the same creature traveling across the country? Were they multiple creatures? Or were they separate manifestations of the same archetypal fear, taking similar forms in different locations? James spent hours reading witness testimonies on paranormal forums and cryptid websites. Many of the accounts were obviously fake or exaggerated, but a significant number had a ring of authenticity that James recognized from his own experience. These witnesses described genuine terror, confusion, and the struggle to rationalize an encounter with something that violated their understanding of reality. One account in particular caught James's attention. It was from a truck driver named Robert Mackenzie, who claimed to have encountered the Maryland Goatman on Fletchertown Road in 2018, almost exactly 5 years before James's own encounter. Robert's description matched James's experience with eerie accuracy. The creature standing in the road, the chase, the attempts to block the truck, the yellow eyes and goat head. Robert had managed to escape by reaching a populated area just as James had. But Robert reported something James hadn't experienced. The creature had followed him, not physically, but in his dreams and waking nightmares. Robert claimed that for months after the encounter, he would see the Goatman in his peripheral vision, standing in shadows, watching from tree lines. The sightings had eventually faded, but Robert admitted he still avoided Maryland entirely, refusing to drive through the state, even if it meant adding hours to his routes. James felt a chill reading this account. Was he going to experience the same thing? Would the Goatman haunt him long after their physical encounter had ended? James tried to put the encounter behind him and return to normal life, but found it impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those yellow eyes staring at him through the windshield. Every unexpected sound made him jump, half expecting to hear that terrible goat scream-human shriek combination. His sleep was plagued by nightmares, in which the Goatman caught him, dragged him into the forest, and did unspeakable things. James's wife, Carol, noticed the change immediately. James had always been calm and steady, but now he was jumpy, anxious, constantly checking windows and doors. When Carol asked what was wrong, James tried to explain what had happened on Fletchertown Road. Carol listened patiently, but James could see the concern in her eyes. She thought he had experienced some kind of breakdown, a hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue. James couldn't blame her. If someone had told him this story 3 weeks ago, he would have thought the same thing. But James knew what he had seen was real. The cracked windshield proved that something had landed on his truck with significant force. The scratches James had found on his truck's hood the next morning, 4 parallel gouges in the paint that looked exactly like claw marks, proved that something with claws had touched his vehicle. James made a decision that both Carol and his dispatcher thought was insane. He was going to return to Fletchertown Road in daylight and investigate the area where he had encountered the Goatman. He needed to find evidence, something tangible that would prove he wasn't losing his mind. On November 5th, 2023, 8 days after his encounter, James drove a rental car to Prince George's County, Maryland. He deliberately chose a small car rather than a truck, reasoning that he needed to be less conspicuous and more maneuverable if something went wrong. James reached Fletchertown Road around noon, when the sun was high, and the forest that had seemed so menacing at night now looked almost peaceful. The road was just as narrow and poorly maintained as James remembered, but in daylight it appeared mundane rather than threatening. James drove slowly along the route he had taken during his encounter, trying to identify the exact locations where events had occurred. He found the spot where he had first seen the Goatman standing in the road. James pulled over, got out of his car, and examined the pavement. There, faintly visible on the worn asphalt, were marks, scratches, 4 parallel lines scored into the road surface, exactly the width James would expect from the creature's hooves if it had been standing in one spot and shifting its weight. James photographed the marks with his phone from multiple angles. It wasn't conclusive proof, but it was something. James continued down the road to the location where the Goatman had landed on his truck's hood. This spot was harder to identify precisely, but James had noted it was approximately 100 yards before the intersection with Route 197. James pulled over again and walked along the edge of the road, examining the forest on both sides. What James found made his heart race. About 30 feet into the tree line on the right side of the road, there was a structure. Not a building, but something like a large nest or den constructed from branches, leaves, and what looked like animal bones. The structure was roughly 10 feet in diameter and 4 feet high, built in a circular depression in the ground. James approached cautiously, every nerve screaming at him to turn back and leave this place. But he had come here for evidence, and this might be exactly what he was looking for. The den smelled terrible, that same nauseating mixture of wet fur and decay that James had smelled when the Goatman had been on his truck's hood. Scattered around the den were bones, lots of bones. James was no expert, but he could identify what looked like deer bones and possibly dog bones, along with other animals he couldn't recognize. Some of the bones showed signs of having been gnawed, and others appeared to have been deliberately arranged in patterns that James couldn't decipher. James photographed everything, taking dozens of pictures of the den from every angle. Then he noticed something that made him freeze. On a nearby tree, about 6 feet off the ground, there were fresh scratches in the bark. 4 parallel gouges, identical to the ones James had found on his truck's hood, and below those scratches, carved into the bark with something sharp, was a symbol. James had never seen anything like it before. It looked vaguely like a pentagram, but with additional lines and curves that gave it an alien quality. James photographed the symbol, then carefully looked around the area. He found more symbols carved on other trees, forming a rough circle around the den. Whatever lived here marked its territory with these signs. James heard a sound in the distance, a rustling in the undergrowth, something moving through the forest approximately 100 yards away. Something large, moving fast, heading in his direction. James didn't wait to see what it was. He ran back to his car, started the engine, and drove away from Fletchertown Road as quickly as the narrow road allowed. In his rearview mirror, just before the trees blocked his view, James saw something emerge from the forest where he had been standing moments before. A tall figure covered in dark fur, standing upright, watching his departing vehicle. The Goatman had been nearby the entire time James had been investigating its den. Back home in Pennsylvania, James created a detailed database of Goatman sightings, compiling information from every source he could find. Online forums, newspaper archives, paranormal investigation reports, and interviews with other witnesses. What emerged was a pattern that was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The Maryland Goatman sightings clustered heavily around 3 locations. Fletchertown Road in Bowie, where James had his encounter, was the most frequently reported site. Governor Bridge Road in Upper Marlboro was second, and various roads surrounding the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center were third. All 3 locations shared common characteristics: dense forest, limited lighting, low traffic volume especially at night, and proximity to water sources, either creeks or the Patuxent River. The sightings also showed a temporal pattern. They spiked in October and November, dropped off dramatically in December through February, resumed at moderate levels in March through May, reduced again in summer, then spiked again in fall. This suggested the creature, whatever it was, had seasonal behavior patterns, being most active in autumn and least active in winter. James also noticed the creature's behavior had evolved over the decades. Early sightings from the 1950s and 60s described a shy, reclusive creature that fled when encountered by humans. Sightings from the 1970s, around the time of the famous dog decapitation incident, described a more aggressive creature that would charge at vehicles or make threatening displays. More recent sightings, including James's own encounter, described an actively hostile creature that pursued vehicles and attempted to block roads. Was the Goatman becoming more aggressive over time, or were there multiple creatures, with the more recent ones being more territorial or aggressive by nature? James couldn't determine the answer from the available data. James also compiled information about the Texas Goatman sightings around Old Alton Bridge. While the origin story was completely different from the Maryland legend, the creature descriptions were remarkably similar. 7 feet tall, goat head, human torso, hooved feet, aggressive behavior. This suggested either the legends had influenced each other or there was a common underlying truth to both accounts. The Texas sightings showed different patterns. They were concentrated very specifically at Old Alton Bridge and the immediate surrounding area, with very few reports more than a mile from the bridge. The sightings did not show the same seasonal variation as the Maryland encounters, occurring year-round with relatively consistent frequency, and the Texas Goatman was associated more with paranormal phenomena like strange lights, voices, and feelings of dread, whereas the Maryland Goatman was associated primarily with physical encounters and attacks. James found this difference interesting. If both legends referred to the same type of creature, why would their behavior be so different? Unless the Maryland Goatman was a physical creature, perhaps a genuine cryptid or undiscovered animal species, while the Texas Goatman was a genuine ghost or spirit, the two would naturally behave differently. James also discovered something disturbing. People who had encountered the Goatman tended to have repeat encounters. Of the 47 witnesses James interviewed, or whose detailed accounts he could verify, 16 reported seeing the creature more than once. 3 witnesses reported 5 or more sightings over periods of several years. This suggested the Goatman either tracked individuals who had seen it, or that people who could see it once had some quality that made them more likely to see it again. James began to wonder if he would be one of those repeat witnesses. Would the Goatman appear to him again? Was it tracking him right now, waiting for another opportunity to encounter him on a dark road? 2 weeks after his return visit to Fletchertown Road, James got his answer. He was making a delivery run through Virginia, nowhere near Maryland, driving on Interstate 81 around 3 in the morning. Traffic was light, and James was alone on a stretch of highway that cut through the Shenandoah Valley. In his side mirror, James saw something that made his blood run cold. Standing on the shoulder of the interstate, illuminated briefly by his trailer's running lights as he passed, was the Goatman. Same 7-foot height, same muscular build, same goat head with curved horns, same yellow eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. The creature stood motionless, watching James's truck pass. Then, as James continued to watch in his mirror, the Goatman dropped to all fours and began running after his truck. James's speedometer showed 70 miles per hour. The creature was keeping pace. For approximately 30 seconds, the Goatman pursued James's truck along Interstate 81, running on the shoulder of the highway at 70 miles per hour without any visible sign of effort or strain. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature veered off the highway and disappeared into the darkness. James pulled over at the next rest area and sat in his cab, shaking. The Goatman had followed him. Not just followed him, but somehow tracked him across state lines to a completely different location, over 150 miles from Fletchertown Road. Whatever this thing was, it had marked James somehow, tagged him, and it wasn't going to leave him alone. James's investigation into the Goatman legend eventually led him to the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, the government facility that figured prominently in the creature's origin story. James wanted to know if there was any truth to the legend that the Goatman had been created by experiments at the facility. The Beltsville Agricultural Research Center is a real place, a facility operated by the United States Department of Agriculture that conducts research on agriculture, nutrition, and food production. It's located in Beltsville, Maryland in Prince George's County and covers approximately 7,000 acres of land, much of it forested. The facility has existed since 1910, making it old enough to have been operating during the earliest reported Goatman sightings in the 1950s. James filed Freedom of Information Act requests with the Department of Agriculture, seeking any records related to genetic research, DNA experiments, or unusual incidents at the Beltsville facility during the 1950s through 70s. The response he received months later was both informative and frustrating. The Department of Agriculture confirmed that the Beltsville facility had conducted genetic research during that period, primarily focused on improving livestock through selective breeding. However, the specific records James requested about DNA manipulation experiments or any incidents involving escaped test subjects had been destroyed during a routine records disposal in 1998, according to standard retention schedules. Either the records had never existed or they had been deliberately destroyed to hide something. James couldn't determine which. James also contacted former employees of the Beltsville facility through online forums and retired government worker groups. Most had never heard of the Goatman legend, but two former employees provided information that James found deeply intriguing. The first was a man named Thomas Hendricks, who had worked as a security guard at Beltsville from 1968 to 1983. Thomas remembered the Goatman legend well, as he had been working security during the famous incident in 1971. According to Thomas, the facility had been placed on unofficial heightened alert during October and November of that year, after local reports of the creature. Guards were instructed to watch for any unusual activity in the forested sections of the property, and several guards reported seeing what they described as a large animal moving through the restricted zones. Thomas himself claimed to have seen the creature once during a night patrol in November 1971. He described it exactly as James and other witnesses had: 7 feet tall, goat head, human body, moving with impossible speed. Thomas had reported the sighting to his supervisor, who had told him to keep quiet about it and had filed no official report. The second former employee who provided useful information was a woman named Dr. Elena Martinez, who had worked as a research scientist at Beltsville from 1977 to 1992. Dr. Martinez was willing to talk to James only on condition of complete anonymity, and she had disturbing information to share. According to Dr. Martinez, there had indeed been genetic research conducted at Beltsville during the 1960s and 70s that went beyond simple livestock breeding. Dr. Martinez had been read into classified projects that involved attempts to create disease-resistant livestock through genetic modification techniques that were cutting edge for the time, while Dr. Martinez insisted she had no direct knowledge of human-animal hybrid experiments. She did confirm that some of the research had produced unexpected and uncontrolled results. There were incidents, Dr. Martinez told James during a phone interview. Animals that developed unexpected traits, livestock that became aggressive or showed intelligence far beyond what should have been possible. There was a project in 1969, before my time, that supposedly had to be terminated after the test subjects became unmanageable and posed a danger to staff. The project was classified and all records were sealed. James pressed for more details, but Dr. Martinez insisted she didn't know specifics. She had only heard rumors from older colleagues, whispered stories about experiments that had gone wrong. But she did say this: If you're asking me whether it's theoretically possible that something could have been created at Beltsville that escaped into the surrounding forest, I would say yes, it's possible. The facility had lax security in the early days, especially in the forested areas. If something dangerous had been created and had escaped, and if people wanted to cover it up, they absolutely could have done so. The government has covered up much stranger things. James thanked Dr. Martinez for her information and spent weeks trying to verify what she had told him. He filed additional FOIA requests, contacted other former Beltsville employees, and searched for any documentation of the 1969 project Dr. Martinez had mentioned. He found nothing. Either the project had never existed, or all traces of it had been successfully erased from the official record. James did find one interesting piece of information in old newspaper archives. In September 1969, a brief article in the Prince George's County News reported that the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center had been temporarily closed to visitors due to a security incident involving escaped research animals. The article provided no details about what animals had escaped or whether they had been recaptured. The facility had reopened to visitors 2 weeks later, with no further explanation. Was this the incident Dr. Martinez had referenced? Had something escaped from Beltsville in September 1969? And if so, could that something have been the origin of the Goatman legend that would explode into public consciousness 2 years later? James managed to track down and interview April Edwards, the woman whose dog had been decapitated in November 1971. The incident that had brought national attention to the Goatman legend. April was now in her 70s, living in a retirement community in Florida, but her memory of the events from 52 years earlier remained vivid and haunting. "People think we were just making it up for attention," April told James during their phone interview. "The Washington Post came and treated it like a joke, like we were just ignorant country folk who didn't know any better. But I know what I saw, and I know what killed my dog." According to April, the trouble had started in mid-October 1971, about 2 weeks after the Prince George's County News published their first article about the Goatman legend. "It was like the article called it out," April said. "Before that article, nobody in our neighborhood had seen anything strange, but after it was published, things started happening." April and her family had lived on a property that backed up to forest near Fletchertown Road. Their dog, a German Shepherd mix named Ginger, usually slept in a doghouse in the backyard. On the night of November 10th, 1971, Ginger had begun barking frantically around 2 in the morning. April's husband had gone outside to check on the dog and found the backyard empty. Ginger was gone. The chain that had secured her to her doghouse broken. The family had searched the property and surrounding woods, but found no trace of the dog. 2 days later, on November 12th, a neighbor walking in the woods approximately half a mile from April's house had found Ginger's remains. The dog had been decapitated with what appeared to be a single clean cut. The head and body were lying separately, about 10 feet apart. There was very little blood at the scene, suggesting the dog had been killed elsewhere and the body moved to this location. "The police said it was probably someone's sick idea of a prank," April recounted. "They thought some teenagers had killed our dog as a Halloween joke, even though it was mid-November, but I knew better. I had seen it." April then described her own encounter with the Goatman, an encounter she had only discussed publicly once before, in an interview with Strange magazine in 1993. On the night of November 14th, 2 days after Ginger's body was found, April had been unable to sleep. She had gotten up around 3 in the morning and was looking out her bedroom window, which faced the backyard and the forest beyond. That's when she saw it. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the house, April said. Just standing there, looking at our house. At first I thought it was a person, maybe someone in a costume, but the proportions were wrong. It was too tall, and the way it moved, When it finally turned and walked back into the forest, it moved like an animal, not like a human trying to walk on all fours, but naturally, like that was how it was supposed to move. April described the creature's head as being definitely a goat. I grew up on a farm. I know what goats look like. This thing had a goat's head with horns and everything, but the body was more like a man's body, muscular and upright. Its legs bent the wrong way, like a goat's back legs. April had woken her husband, but by the time he got to the window, the creature was gone. April's husband had been skeptical, suggesting she had seen a deer or perhaps a person in the distance, and her frightened mind had misinterpreted it. But April was certain of what she had seen. "I know the difference between a deer and a monster," April insisted, "and I know that thing killed my dog. It had marked our property somehow, claimed it as its territory. That's why Ginger was killed. She was defending our yard from something that considered our land part of its hunting ground." James also interviewed other witnesses from various periods and locations. A Maryland State Police officer named Dennis Carroll, who had responded to multiple Goatman sighting calls during the 1970s, described the phenomenon as mass hysteria that occasionally intersected with something real. Officer Carroll believed most reported sightings were false, teenagers pranking each other, or genuine misidentifications of animals, but he admitted there were a few cases that he couldn't explain. "I responded to a call in 1976. Guy driving on Governor Bridge Road claimed something had jumped on his car and tried to break his windshield," Officer Carroll recounted. "When I got there, his windshield was cracked, and there were marks on the hood of his car that looked like they'd been made by something with claws. The guy was terrified, genuinely shaken up. I've seen enough scared people to know when someone's faking. This guy wasn't faking." Officer Carroll had filed a report describing vandalism of unknown origin, but privately he had wondered if there was something in those woods that occasionally came out and harassed drivers. "I patrolled those roads for 30 years, Officer Carroll said, "and I can tell you there's something not quite right about that area. Animals behave strangely there. Electronics malfunction more often than they should. And I saw things a few times that I couldn't explain, shadows that moved wrong, sounds that didn't match any animal I knew. I never saw the Goatman myself, but I believe something is out there." James compiled dozens of similar interviews. Most witnesses were reluctant to talk publicly, afraid of being ridiculed or thought insane. But when speaking privately, away from skeptical audiences, their stories had a consistency that James found compelling. These people weren't making things up. They had encountered something real, something that terrorized and traumatized them, something they struggled to explain or understand. James's investigation eventually led him to Denton, Texas, to examine the legend of the Texas Goatman and determine if there was any connection between the Maryland and Texas phenomena. Old Alton Bridge, also known as Goatman's Bridge, is located on the border between Denton and Copper Canyon, about 10 miles from downtown Denton. The bridge was built in 1984 and is now closed to vehicle traffic, preserved as a historic landmark. James visited the bridge on a warm November afternoon and found it to be a surprisingly peaceful location. The bridge spans Hickory Creek, with wooded areas on both sides. During daylight, it appeared to be nothing more than a scenic, historic structure. But according to local legend, the bridge transformed at night into one of the most haunted locations in Texas. The Texas Goatman legend centered on Oscar Washburn, an African-American goat farmer who allegedly lived near the bridge in the early 20th century. According to the story, Washburn was a successful businessman who gained prosperity raising and selling goats. He placed a sign on Old Alton Bridge that read, "This way to the Goatmans," directing customers to his farm. This success supposedly angered local members of the Ku Klux Klan, who in 1938 kidnapped Washburn, brought him to the bridge at night, and hanged him from the bridge's support beams. The story gets darker. According to legend, when the Klansmen looked down from the bridge to confirm Washburn was dead, his body had disappeared, though the rope still hung from the bridge. Enraged and frightened, The clansman went to Washburn's home and murdered his wife and family. Washburn's spirit, transformed into a monstrous creature, now haunts the bridge, seeking revenge against those who wronged him. James spent several days in Denton, interviewing locals and investigating the legend. What he found was both interesting and disturbing. Unlike the Maryland Goatman, which had consistent physical sighting reports, the Texas Goatman was reported primarily as a paranormal phenomenon. Witnesses described strange lights, disembodied voices, feelings of being watched, and occasional glimpses of a shadowy figure with horns. Actual physical encounters with a tangible creature were rare. James spoke with Daria Parker, a paranormal investigator who had visited Goatman's Bridge over 30 times. "The bridge is definitely haunted," Daria insisted, "but I don't think the Goatman there is the same kind of entity as the Maryland Goatman. The Texas version feels more like a traditional ghost or spirit. It manifests paranormal phenomena rather than physical presence." Daria described experiences she and other investigators had at the bridge. Unexplained EMF spikes, voices captured on recording devices, cameras malfunctioning, and the sensation of being touched or grabbed by invisible hands. But she had never seen an actual physical creature. "The legend says, if you cross the bridge with your headlights off, the Goatman will appear," Daria explained. "I've tried this dozens of times. I've never seen a physical creature, but I have had some absolutely terrifying experiences with voices and sensations that I can't explain." James also investigated the historical basis of the Oscar Washburn story and found it was almost certainly fictional. There were no records of an Oscar Washburn living in or near Denton in the 1930s. No newspaper accounts of a lynching at Old Alton Bridge. No documentation of a successful African-American goat farmer in that location during that period. The legend appeared to have been created sometime in the 1970s or 80s, possibly inspired by the Maryland Goatman legend, and had been retrofitted with a tragic backstory to explain the haunting. Despite the lack of historical foundation, James couldn't deny that something unusual was happening at Old Alton Bridge. Too many credible witnesses had reported strange experiences there for it all to be imagination or hoaxes. James decided to spend a night at the bridge himself to see what would happen. On November 18th, 2023, James arrived at Goatman's Bridge around 11 p.m. He parked his rental car near the bridge and walked onto the old structure with a flashlight, voice recorder and camera. For the first hour, nothing happened. The bridge was quiet except for the sound of wind and water flowing in Hickory Creek below. Then, around midnight, James began to feel uneasy. It started as a subtle sensation, a feeling of being watched. James shined his flashlight into the woods on both sides of the bridge but saw nothing. The feeling intensified. James's skin prickled and he felt a presence nearby, something invisible observing him. Then James heard it, a voice, male, deep, speaking words James couldn't quite make out. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the bridge structure. James's voice recorder was running, capturing audio. "Is someone there?" James called out. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to understand what happened here." The voice responded, but again James couldn't understand the words. It sounded angry, anguished. Then James saw movement. Not a physical creature, but a shadow. A dark shape, approximately 7 feet tall, with what looked like horns, moving across the far end of the bridge. The shadow had no source. There was no object casting it. It simply existed, a pool of darkness darker than the surrounding night. James felt genuine fear. This was different from his encounter with the Maryland Goatman. That had been physical, tangible, something he could see and potentially fight against. This was something else, something that existed in a different way, something against which physical resistance would be meaningless. The shadow moved closer. James could now see details, or rather, see the absence of details. Where the shadow passed, it seemed to absorb light, creating a void in James's vision. The shape was humanoid but wrong, proportions slightly off, movements fluid but unnatural. James heard the voice again, closer now, and this time he could make out some words. "My bridge, my land, leave." James backed away toward his car. The shadow didn't pursue, but James felt its attention focused on him, a weight of awareness that was almost physical. James reached his car, got in, and drove away from Goatman's bridge. In his rearview mirror, he saw the shadow standing at the end of the bridge, watching him depart. When James reviewed his voice recorder later, he found he had captured the voices. Multiple voices, overlapping, some male and some female, speaking in angry, anguished tones. He could make out fragments. "They killed us, took everything. This is ours. Leave this place." But nowhere on the recording was there any sound of a physical creature. No footsteps, no breathing, no sounds of movement, just voices coming from nowhere. James concluded that the Maryland and Texas Goatmen were fundamentally different phenomena. The Maryland creature was physical, a genuine cryptid or unknown animal that existed in the material world. The Texas entity was paranormal, a spirit or collection of spirits manifesting at a location connected to tragedy and injustice. Both were real in their own ways, both were terrifying, but they weren't the same thing, despite sharing a name and similar appearance in their respective legends. After months of investigation, interviews, and personal experiences, James developed a theory about what the Maryland Goatman actually was. It wasn't a theory he could prove, but it was the only explanation that fit all the evidence he had gathered. James believed the Maryland Goatman was a genuine unknown animal, a cryptid that had somehow emerged from the forests of Prince George's County and had been living there for at least 70 years. Possibly, it was the result of genetic experiments at the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center, as the legend claimed. More likely, James thought, it was something that had existed in those forests long before the research center was built, something that had simply gone unnoticed until population growth and suburban development brought more people into its territory. The creature showed behavior consistent with a territorial predator. It marked its territory with symbols carved on trees. It had a den where it brought prey. It aggressively challenged intruders, chasing vehicles and making threat displays. And critically, it showed learning and adaptation, becoming more aggressive over the decades as it grew more familiar with humans and vehicles. But James also believed there was something more to the creature, something that couldn't be explained by simple biology. The Goatman's speed and agility were beyond what any known animal could achieve. Its apparent ability to track James across state lines suggested intelligence and perhaps even supernatural awareness far beyond what a natural animal should possess. And there was the question of age. If the creature had been created in an experiment in the 1960s, it would now be over 60 years old. Most large mammals don't live that long. Yet the creature James had encountered appeared to be in its prime, powerful and vital. James speculated that the Goatman might be something in between natural and supernatural. Perhaps the experiments at Beltsville, if they had indeed occurred, had created something that existed partially outside normal physical laws. A creature that was biological but also quantum, existing in a state that allowed it to move between physical locations in ways that appeared impossible. Or perhaps exposure to whatever chemicals or radiation had been involved in its creation had altered the creature's biology in ways that granted it extraordinary abilities and extended lifespan. James also considered the possibility that there might be more than one Goatman. Perhaps the original creature, if it had been created in the 60s, had reproduced. There might be a breeding population of goatmen in the forests of Prince George's County, which would explain the sightings, spanning multiple decades. But James had found no evidence of this. All the sightings described a single creature, or at most two creatures, never groups or families. The Goatman appeared to be solitary, which suggested either it was a unique individual or that reproduction was extremely rare or impossible. James shared his theory with other researchers and investigators. receiving mixed reactions. Some thought he was on the right track. Others believed he was overthinking what was simply a large animal, possibly a bear or escaped exotic pet that people's imaginations had transformed into a monster. Still others insisted the Goatman was entirely paranormal, a tulpa or thought form with no physical reality. James didn't claim to have all the answers, but he knew what he had experienced. He knew what he had seen in his headlights on Fletchertown Road, and he knew that knowledge had changed him forever. He could never again look at dark forests or lonely roads the same way. He would always wonder what might be watching from the shadows. James Reeves never encountered the Maryland Goatman again after his sighting on Interstate 81 in Virginia. He continued to drive trucks for a living, but he permanently altered his routes to avoid Prince George's County and the areas around the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. When asked by other drivers about his encounter, James told his story honestly, knowing many would think he was crazy or making it up, but James believed it was important to warn others, to let them know what might be out there on those dark back roads. James created a website documenting the Goatman legend, compiling witness testimonies, historical research, and his own experiences. The site received hundreds of thousands of visits from people around the world who were fascinated by cryptid legends. Some visitors shared their own encounters, adding to the growing database of Goatman sightings that James maintained. In the year following James's encounter, there were at least 15 reported sightings of the Maryland Goatman, most of them in Prince George's County, but a few from as far away as West Virginia and Pennsylvania. The creature's range appeared to be expanding, or perhaps it was simply being seen more often because more people were looking for it and knew what to watch for. James warned every trucker he knew, if you're driving through Prince George's County, Maryland at night, stay on main highways. Avoid back roads like Fletchertown Road and Governor Bridge Road. Keep your windows up and doors locked. Don't stop if you see something standing in the road. And if a creature with a goat's head and a man's body appears in your headlights, don't slow down to get a better look. Accelerate and get away as fast as you can, because the Goatman isn't a legend. It isn't a story made up to scare teenagers. It's real, it's out there, and it's still hunting. James Reeves still drives trucks across America, covering thousands of miles every week, but he never drives through Prince George's County anymore. He takes longer routes, adds hours to his deliveries, pays higher tolls, anything to avoid that section of Maryland where something that shouldn't exist prowls the forests and back roads. Sometimes, late at night when James is alone on a dark highway, he thinks about the Goatman. He wonders where it is right now, who it might be hunting, whether someone else is having the same terrifying encounter he had, and he wonders whether the creature